So welcome to this second part on how to align assessment with your learning outcomes or the intended learning outcome. Before I get into it, I would like to talk about principle of constructive alignment. And what does principle of constructive alignment really mean is when you start the course, you need to be very specific about what are the intended learning outcome of this course. We then need to design all our teaching and learning activities which are conducted in a way that it helps students to achieve those intended learning outcomes, and then design assessment where assessment is in alignment or is able to measure if those learning outcomes have been achieved or not. Before I go into further detail, what we are really looking into at higher education these days is outcome-based teaching and learning. In outcome-based teaching learning, this principle of constructive alignment becomes very important because we are really trying to define in a specific way what the learning outcomes are for our current graduates, be it a program learning outcome or the course learning outcome or the session learning outcomes. And the key point in the constructive alignment is that there should be a clear alignment of the intended learning outcomes, the teaching learning activity, as well as the assessment task. And assessment tasks should be in such a way where we are able to measure if the learning outcomes were achieved or not. So now when you have written your course learning outcomes, which I'm referring here as intended learning outcomes, you need to see if you have incorporated various types of assessment tasks in the entire course to address different learning outcomes. Because your learning outcomes which you would have written would be at different cognitive level, using different action verb. Few of it might be at much lower level at knowledge recall level, or it could be at higher level where you want students to be able to analyze or create certain aspects of the content. In doing so, you need to design various types of assessment tasks in the entire semester where you're asking students to either, design a model or design a research project, or they are doing some group presentations or they're designing web pages. I'll give you more examples a little bit later in this session. Once you do so, you also need to see if all the learning outcomes are being addressed in your assessment task, be it formative or be it summative. You can divide it, different learning outcomes to be assessed at different stages. But the key point is if you have that as a learning outcome of your course, it needs to be assessed, and we need to assess it in a systematic way and see if the students have been able to achieve those outcomes or not. We also need to see if there is a balanced coverage of these learning outcomes. Are these learning outcomes there? In every course, we have 2 or 3 learning outcomes which are really critical and important for students' learning for the future learning in the course. And hence, it's important for us to see that the important ones gets more coverage in the entire course and ensure that we are testing students' ability to achieve those learning outcomes using different types of assessment tasks. And that's what the last point here is. The important ILOs have been given appropriate emphasis or not. The good way when you're designing the course, as I said, assessment is not just about writing questions, but having a good assessment plan as how I am going to assess students on each of these learning outcomes. Just to give you an example, if you have learning outcomes are 4 learning outcomes which are at 4 different levels. And if your first one is at the level of remember, the different types of assessment task which is appropriate for that particular intended learning outcome is you could use questions which are either multiple choice questions, fill in the blanks, or match the following, where you're just testing students' ability to retain certain information or rather acknowledge recall level. With MCQs, it really depends on the teacher how you design these multiple choice questions. You can pitch it at a much higher level where it requires much deeper thinking. But if your learning outcome, which you have specified in the course, is at much lower level, at the remember level, then keep your questions at that particular level where it only requires students to recall whatever has been delivered to them in that particular course. And that's what it means, is aligning the assessment task at the level at which you want the learning to happen. Giving you another example, if your learning outcome have used or is designed at the create level, then your assessment should be, assessment task should be like your research project, where you're asking to do students a 3-month or a 6-month research project, asking them to do portfolios, writing essays, or design web page. All of these would require them to create a new piece based on whatever information they have gathered, or be it in the classroom or outside the classroom. So now if you're designing an assessment, if your learning outcome is at create level and you're giving the students questions like match the following, then definitely there is a misalignment. And this is what I've been trying to convey, that you need to look at all your learning outcomes of the course and then design different types of assessment which is in alignment with the level what you want students to achieve. Now, few practical tips. So we all are, used to of writing questions, and that's how we design our assessment. The important thing I would like you to do is get an exam or term paper, the summative assessment one, from your course from the past 1 or 2 years. Look at the questions and see if these questions are in alignment with whatever you have written as the learning outcome of the course. If not, then either the learning outcome needs to be changed or your questions need to be rewritten so that it's in alignment with what you really want to assess in terms of students' learning. Next, also ask, when you look at these question papers, are all the intended learning outcomes being addressed or not? Is this exam paper testing just 2 or 3 learning outcomes rather than 6 or 7 which you have for the entire course? If not, once again, that needs to be addressed. Also look at if there is a balanced coverage of all the ILOs, and has the important ILOs got the important or appropriate emphasis in this exam paper. This is a good practice for making sure what you're assessing and what you're writing as your intended learning outcome in the course are well aligned or not. And if you are struggling to write your learning outcome for the course, the good way to start writing learning outcome for the course is look at your exam paper. Look what you really want your students to learn or achieve from that particular course or the program, and looking at those questions and at what level those questions have been asked, you can write your learning outcomes. Now, the last part of my session is going to be on how to design rubrics, which I will be conducting on my 3rd session. Thank you for now.